Hello everybody, my name is Mr. Rader. This video is for students taking participation in government. About to look at day 20 of Unit 2, looking at the lesson on judicial review. And this video will focus specifically on the independent work of the lesson, where students will look at the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court of the United States case, Shelby versus Holder, 2013. In the beginning of the lesson, your teacher will have you look at a document called the Quandary of Judicial Review and respond to these two focus questions. And you'll respond to those questions by typing your response into the blue box for adding text. A few things to point out in terms of my own annotations for this particular document. First, I want to point out some information on the context. So we can see the writer of the article is Mark Pullman. As an attorney and a writer for the National Review. And I noticed in the context, it says that it talks about political, social, cultural affairs from a conservative perspective. So this is just a reminder to think about four moves and a habit, always to consider who the writers are of our sources and potential biases that they might have, and just to use some lateral searching and just look up who they are if we want to know more about them. And we could see that the difficulty of judicial review, according to Mr. Pulliam, is about the court's interpretation of the Constitution and whether or not the court should be very activist or quote unquote aggressive, or if they're being too passive. So those are some of the criticisms of judicial review that I noted in the first paragraph after introducing the concept of judicial review in the court case Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And then looking at the definitions of activism. So for the independent part of the lesson, what you either did in class today or what you're about to do in class tomorrow is look at the facts of the case in question for Shelby versus Holder. And the easy way to do it is to click on this hyperlink. That'll take us to oyas.org. And this gives us very basic information on the facts of the case, along with the facts and then the question the court had to consider, which was, does the renewal of Section 5 of the Voter Rights Act under the constraints of Section 4 exceed Congress's authority under the 14th and 15th Amendments, and therefore violate the 10th Amendment and Article 4 of the Constitution? We could see what the decision was. Right away, we see that it's a 5-4 decision, so we see that it's going to be a controversial decision. So when we look at the resources themselves, I want to start first with the opinion of the court by Chief Justice John Roberts. And as I mentioned with the document from the National Review, it may be helpful to really look into, just briefly, the biography of the writer of the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion to learn more about the biases of the justices themselves. So for example, Justice John Roberts was appointed to the Supreme Court by President George W. Bush in 2005. So he tends to have a more conservative outlook than some of the more liberal justices, which you'll notice in the dissenting opinion. And again, that just helps us to understand the foundations of their thinking. So when we look at the actual case, we want to consider the kinds of evidence that is being presented in terms of the opinion of the writers of the majority and the dissenting opinions. So to point out a few things that I highlighted, we can see here the quote, the framers of the Constitution intended the states to keep for themselves, as provided in the 10th Amendment, the power to regulate elections. So that's really what the issue is, looking at the Voting Rights Act and trying to see if this was an unlawful interference in the affairs of individual states. And thinking about the Voting Rights Act, you may remember from last year in your U.S. history class that it was passed in 1965 during the Civil Rights era in a direct response to clear institutionalized racist practices that were implemented throughout, most notably in the South during the time of Jim Crow, including literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other things of that nature. The question is, thinking about it decades later, is this still a necessary component? So when we think about the decision itself, we know we're seeing here that it was decided in 2013, which comes 4 years after an earlier case that was being cited in this document. So when we think about the Voting Rights Act from the majority's perspective, we can see that they claim that it departs from these basic principles, that it quote unquote suspends all changes to state election laws, and that essentially the states have to beseech or beg the federal government for permission to implement laws that they would otherwise execute on their own. And Roberts argues that in addition to this problem, it only applies to 9 states and several additional counties, which was part of their decision making. Now, by contrast, and you'll see in your teacher will likely provide you a total of 4 different documents looking at majority and dissenting opinions. We're only looking at 2 in this brief video. In the dissenting opinion from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, again, as I mentioned earlier with Justice Roberts, it is useful to briefly look at the biography of the writer. In this case, Justice Ginsburg is one of the more liberal justices in the court, and that definitely influences her perspective in terms of the decision-making process. So the first area highlighted in this opening paragraph was looking at the connections to systemic racism, specifically with the Voting Rights Act, and really thinking about it in terms of her foundations for her opinion in this case. And then looking at specific things, I just want to point out this paragraph on page 2, where we see this idea of the connection to our demand for a record of violations of voting issues, equivalent to the one made earlier, would expose Congress to a catch-22. If the statute was working, there would be less evidence of discrimination. So opponents might argue that Congress should not be allowed to renew the statute. In contrast, if the statute was not working, there would be plenty of evidence of discrimination, but minimal or scant reason to renew a failed regulatory regime. So again, we can clearly see in these 2 decisions differing perspectives in terms of the things that the justices choose to focus on. This is in many ways, when we look at media literacy, this is an example of selection and omission bias. It's the particular things that justices want to emphasize to really get their opinions across to their audience, right? So as we go through this lesson, and as you read through it, you want to consider again, what was the justice arguing their opinion? What kinds of evidence are they marshaling to support their case? And then do you think that their decisions are relying on a lot of judicial activism? Right. And then after you discuss in your groups as a class, you'll likely, or you've already likely have done this, you'll look at these 2 questions, like, was the court actually engaging in judicial activism in this court case? And you'll again look back at that definition of activism in the introduction, and then really consider thinking about this idea of judicial review, striking down that element of the Voting Rights Act. Does that promote or hinder democratic values? All right. So I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll see you in the next series.